You don't belong here. You never will. Go home and learn to sew. Marlowe Finch heard it clearly above the sound of the exhaust fans and the clatter of pans and the controlled chaos of a professional kitchen at full service. She did not turn around. She kept her knife moving, steady, even strokes through the shallots, each piece uniform, each cut deliberate, because her mother had taught her that precision was a form of dignity, and dignity did not require an audience to be real. The voice belonged to Prescott Dale, the senior line cook, who had been making variations of the same comment since Marlowe's third day at Altgate Culinary House. He said it the way people say things they believe so thoroughly they no longer need to think about them. She had stopped expecting it to stop. She was 26 years old. She had a bachelor's degree in culinary arts from Fenwick College, where she had graduated in the top 4 of her class and spent 2 additional summers in unpaid apprenticeships because she understood, earlier than most of her classmates, that the gap between talent and opportunity was crossed by preparation, not by waiting. She was the only woman on the line at Altgate. She had known this going in. She applied anyway. Her father, Grover Finch, was a plumber. He left the house at 6:15 every morning in a truck that needed a new muffler and came home at 7 in the evening, smelling of pipe compound and honest work. On Saturdays, he sometimes drove across town to fix leaks for elderly residents who could not afford the call-out fee, and he did this without telling anyone, without a receipt, without the story of it. Once, when Marlowe was 12, she had asked him why he fixed things for free. He had looked up from the kitchen table where he was eating and said, "Because I can, and they need it. That's the whole reason." She had been thinking about that answer, in one form or another, ever since. Her mother, Theodora Finch, was a tailor. She worked from the back room of their house on Caldwell Lane, her sewing machine a constant rhythmic presence beneath the ordinary sounds of family life. She had told Marlowe once while adjusting the hem of a dress with the focused patience of someone for whom every detail was significant. Cooking and stitching are the same, really. Both are about precision, both are about care, and both are about making something that fits someone so well they forget it took work. Marlowe had carried that sentence into every kitchen she had ever entered.
She had joined Aldgate in January. By March, she understood her position precisely. She was the prep cook who received no credit. She was the assistant who was handed the least visible tasks, chopping, cleaning, stocking, and given them not as a progression towards something larger, but as a quiet suggestion that this was her ceiling. The head chef, a broad and technically skilled man named Carmichael Hess, ran his kitchen with the particular authority of someone who had never been seriously challenged and had mistaken the absence of challenge for proof of superiority. He was not a cruel man in the obvious sense. He was the subtler kind, the kind who never directly excluded but consistently overlooked, who would taste something Marlowe had prepared, nod without comment, and then present it to the table as his own conception. By year 2, Marlowe had learned the geometry of invisibility. She learned which corner of the kitchen she could work in without attracting commentary. She learned how to be so consistently excellent at the tasks she was given that there was never a reason to find fault, and how to be so quiet about her excellence that it didn't threaten anyone. She came in early, she stayed late, she read cookbooks on the bus home and practiced techniques on her days off in the kitchen at Caldwell Lane while her mother stitched in the next room and her father drank tea at the table, and the evenings settled around the 3 of them like something reliable. In year 3, the thing happened that almost broke her. Carmichael presented a braised lamb preparation at a regional industry dinner that had been, in its entirety, Marlowe's conception. The spice profile, the citrus reduction, the way the dish was plated to suggest both restraint and abundance. He received a commendation for it. She watched from the back of the room where the kitchen staff stood, and she felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. She said nothing. She drove home. She sat in her car in the driveway of Caldwell Lane for 20 minutes before she went inside. Her father was still up, reading at the kitchen table. He looked at her face and did not ask what happened. He said, "Skill grows in silence, Marlo. The people who take credit for other people's work are always eventually found out. The work remembers who made it." She almost quit in year 4. There was a service where everything went wrong, not through any fault of hers, but she was the most available target when Carmichael needed somewhere to direct his frustration, and the words he used were specific and dismissive in a way that stripped several layers from her in front of the entire line. She drove to Caldwell Lane that night and sat with her mother, and Theodora held her hand and didn't try to fix anything, just held her hand, which was exactly right. She went back the next day. Year 5 brought a quiet shift. A new sous chef position opened when the previous one left for another city, and Marlo was given it, not with ceremony, not with acknowledgement of why she deserved it, but practically, because she was the most capable person on the line, and even Carmichael's bias could not entirely override the operational reality of the kitchen. She was sous chef in title now. In practice, she had been managing the line for 18 months already. She began, carefully and incrementally, to redesign the menu, not dramatically, not with announcement, but through the slow accumulation of small improvements, a more balanced spice profile here, a cleaner presentation there, a dish that drew on the kind of cooking she had grown up with, food that tasted like it came from somewhere real, rather than from ambition alone.
The restaurant was one of 11 locations owned by Holt Meridian Hospitality Group. She did not know this particularly. She knew it the way you know the name of the company on your paycheck, functionally, without depth. She did not know anything about Calder Holt. Calder Holt was 34 years old, and he was the kind of man who had built something significant by understanding, before most people around him did, what things were actually worth. He had started Holt Meridian at 26 with one property and a business model that treated hospitality as a craft rather than a transaction, and he had grown it over 8 years into an 11-location group with a reputation for quality that came from genuine standards rather than marketing. He was disciplined in a way that looked effortless from the outside and required enormous internal maintenance that no one saw. He was the kind of man other men called successful, and whose own internal experience of that success was considerably more complicated than the word suggested. His wife's name had been Sable. She had been a chef, trained, serious, gifted in the way that certain people are gifted with something as though it were simply part of their composition rather than an achievement. She had cooked with a quality that Calder had always understood emotionally, even when he lacked the language for it technically. Her food tasted like being cared for. That was the only way he had ever been able to put it to himself, and he had thought of it over the years as something private and somewhat embarrassing to articulate, and so he never had. On the afternoon of their son Remy's 3rd birthday, they had gone to a party supply store for balloons and paper plates and the small specific things that make a child's birthday feel like the event it is. Remy had seen a cluster of helium balloons tethered outside the store and run toward them with the focused joy of a 3-year-old who has identified the most important thing in the immediate vicinity. A delivery truck, turning too wide at the corner, had come faster than the moment allowed for. Sable had moved without thinking. This is the thing Calder had never been able to entirely make peace with, that she had not deliberated, had not calculated, had simply moved, because Remy was there and the truck was there, and her body had made a decision before her mind had been consulted. Remy was 4 now. He was a quiet child, gentle in the way of children who have absorbed more than they should have to absorb at their age. He lived with Calder in the house they had all shared, and with his grandmother, Millicent Holt, who was 68 and carried her own weight quietly. Her husband, Calder's father, had been in a coma for 14 months following a stroke, and Millicent drove to the care facility on Tuesdays and Fridays and sat with him and talked to him the way you talk to someone you are not ready to stop talking to. She was a woman of considerable emotional strength and no complaints. Calder had not entered a kitchen, a real one, working, full of the smell of food and heat and the particular aliveness of cooking in progress since the week after Sable died. He had managed his restaurant group from offices and conference rooms and the front of house of his locations, and the kitchen had become a place he managed from a distance in every sense. He associated it with her. The smell of something braising, the sound of a pan deglazing, the way steam moved above a pot, all of it was Sable, and Sable was the thing he could not approach directly without something in him going very quiet and very still in a way that he could not afford to sustain and function. He had been told by his operations manager, a capable woman named Denise Farrow, that the Aldgate location had been underperforming for 2 quarters. Not dramatically, it was not failing, but quietly, in the way that things underperform when the energy running through them is slightly misaligned. He decided to visit in person, unannounced, on a Thursday evening in November. He did not tell anyone who he was when he arrived. He was seated as a regular guest in a corner table, and he ordered from the menu with the attention of someone who is reading it as a document rather than a list of options. What he did not know, sitting at that corner table in the amber light of Aldgate's dining room, was that Carmichael Hess had called in with a back injury that afternoon. The kitchen was running under Marlowe Finch, who had stepped into the full head role not for the first time. She had done it twice before during Carmichael's absences, quietly and without any particular recognition of the fact, but for the first time on a Thursday service with a full house. She ran the kitchen the way her father ran a job, steadily, without drama, with the attention of someone who understood that the work itself was the point, and everything else was secondary. She had, that evening, put on a special, a dish that was not on the regular menu, something she had been developing slowly over several weeks. It was a slow braised short rib with a root vegetable preparation and a sauce that had taken her 4 attempts to calibrate properly, each attempt moving closer to something she was trying to express rather than achieve, a quality she associated with her mother's cooking, with her father's simple meals, with the specific warmth of food made not to impress, but to sustain. She called it, on the specials board in her own handwriting, simply short rib, root vegetables, herb jus. Calder Holt ordered it because it was the only item on the specials board and because something in the simplicity of the description caught his attention. It arrived. He looked at it for a moment, the way it was plated, which was restrained and honest, nothing performing, everything earning its place on the plate. He picked up his fork. The first bite reached him, and he stopped. He did not move for a moment. The restaurant continued around him, the soft sound of conversation, the movement of servers, the amber light unchanged. He sat very still with the fork in his hand and felt something he had not felt in 2 years, which was the specific sensation of being, without warning and without defense, moved by something he had not prepared for.
It was not Sable's recipe. He knew that immediately. He was not a man given to confusion about facts. But it carried the same quality as her cooking, that fundamental quality he had never been able to articulate properly. Food that tasted like being cared for. Food that had been made by someone who understood that what they were doing was not just technical. Food that had memory in it, and patience, and the particular warmth of someone who had learned to cook not from ambition, but from love. He set the fork down. He looked at the table. He was aware, in the way of a person who has spent 2 years maintaining a very specific internal architecture, that the architecture was experiencing something it was not designed for. He pressed his lips together. He put his hand flat on the tablecloth. And then, quietly and without warning, and in a corner table of a restaurant he owned, Calder Holt, a 34-year-old self-made man who had not cried publicly since the funeral, felt tears come, and could not entirely stop them. The server, a young man named Tate, appeared with professional concern. Calder composed himself with the speed of someone who has practiced at composure. He said quietly, "It's fine. I'd like to speak with whoever prepared this dish." Tate went to the kitchen. He came back and said that the sous chef, Marlowe Finch, had prepared the special this evening. Calder sat with that for a moment. Then he asked for the check, paid it, and left without going to the kitchen. He sat in his car in the parking lot on Aldgate Street for a long time. He pulled the personnel files the following morning. He read Marlo Finch's record carefully. 3 years as prep, 2 as line cook, 1 as sous chef. No complaints, no incidents. A note from a previous manager that said simply, reliable, technically excellent, appears to work beyond her assigned scope consistently. He read between those lines with the attention of someone who understood what they meant. He called Denise Farrow and asked her, without explanation, to run a full review of the Aldgate Kitchen's menu evolution over the past 18 months. Denise called back 2 days later. Called her, she said, with the careful tone of someone who has found something significant and is deciding how to frame it. About 40% of the current menu has been quietly revised. The revisions are consistently better. Better balance, better margin, better guest response. None of them are credited to anyone in the documentation, but the timing traces back to when Marlo Finch was made sous chef. He was quiet for a moment. What do you know about her? She's been on the line for 6 years. She started in prep. The head chef, Carmichael Hess, has received the industry attention for the kitchen. She has received none publicly. A pause. She's never filed a complaint, never demanded credit. She just works. Calder thought about a dish that had made him cry at a corner table. He thought about a woman he had never met who had cooked it the way his wife had cooked, not with the same technique, not with the same recipe, but with the same fundamental understanding of what food was actually for. He did not promote her immediately. He was not a man who made decisions from emotion alone, and he understood that what he had experienced at that table was real but required verification of a different kind. Over the next 3 months, he visited Aldgate 7 times, twice announced, 5 times not. He watched how the kitchen ran when Marlo led it. He watched how the staff responded to her, not with the deference that fear produces, but with the particular ease of people who trust the person in charge. He watched how she moved through the kitchen, which was with the same quality he had noticed in the plating of the dish, nothing performing, everything purposeful. On his 4th unannounced visit, something happened that he had not anticipated.
He had come during a quiet afternoon service, and he was sitting in the dining room when the kitchen door opened and Millicent appeared with Remy. She had brought him to visit, as she occasionally did on quiet afternoons, because Remy liked the dining room at Aldgate. He liked the way the light came through the front windows in the early afternoon, falling in long rectangles across the wooden floor. Calder had nodded at them from his table and returned to the menu he was reviewing. Remy, with the purposeful wandering of a 4-year-old, had pushed open the kitchen door. Marlo was alone in the prep area, working through mise en place for the evening service. She looked up when the door opened and saw a small boy looking at her with the serious, assessing eyes of a child who is deciding whether a situation is safe. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, simply and warmly, "Hi, are you hungry?" He nodded. She found a small portion of brioche dough she had been working with and set it on the low prep table with a small rolling pin. "Do you want to help me with this part?" He climbed up onto the step stool without being asked. She showed him how to press the dough, and he did it with the careful attention of a child who is taking something seriously. They worked in silence for a few minutes. Then he looked up at her and said, "It smells like my mama used to make." Marlo went very still for just a moment. Then she said, gently, "That's one of the best things someone can say about food." He looked at the dough. "She's gone now," he said. "I know," she said softly, not because she knew his story, but because something in the way he said it told her this was a thing he needed to say without being redirected. "That's a really hard thing." He nodded seriously. Then he went back to pressing the dough. Millicent had appeared in the doorway a moment later, and the expression on her face as she watched her grandson work quietly beside a young woman in a kitchen, the first kitchen he had entered willingly since his mother died, was the expression of a woman watching something heal that she had worried might not. Calder had seen it too from the doorway, where he had come when Millicent first appeared. He stood there and watched his son press brioche dough beside a woman he didn't know, and something shifted in him that had been locked for 2 years. Not dramatically, not in all at once, but in the specific way that things shift when the right key is finally and unexpectedly applied. He had been, he understood, standing in that doorway, blaming Remy. Not consciously, not in any way he had allowed himself to name, but in the way he had held himself at a slight distance from his son, in the careful rather than warm quality of his presence, in the tightness that came into him when Remy reached for his hand in the way children reach for hands. There had been something underneath it that he had been managing rather than addressing. Standing in the kitchen doorway watching his son smile for the first time in months, Calder Holt felt the weight of that clearly enough that he could not avoid it. He promoted Marlo Finch to head chef of Aldgate in January, 7 months after the November evening when he had sat at the corner table and cried. He told her in a meeting with Denise Farrow present, and he told her plainly that he had reviewed her work comprehensively, that the menu development over the past 18 months showed a level of culinary intelligence and care that had been significantly under-recognized, and that he wanted to give her the creative authority and the title that her contributions had already earned. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "I want to rebuild the entire menu from the ground up. I want it to taste like something real."
"Yes," he said. "And I want credit on everything." "Yes," he said again. "That's not a question." She nodded once, and something in her expression settled. Not relief exactly, because she had not been waiting for this to validate herself. It was more like the settling of something that had been carried a long way and could now, finally, be set down in the right place. Carmichael Hess left the following month. He was not dismissed. He was offered a lateral role at another location that he declined, and then he resigned. Marlo did not comment on this to anyone. Over the following year, the Aldgate location's performance shifted measurably, not because anything had been dramatized, but because a kitchen running under someone who understood what food was for produced food that people responded to. Guest reviews began to include the word home with unusual frequency, people writing that the meal had felt like home, had tasted like home, had reminded them of something they hadn't tasted in years. Marlo read these reviews carefully. She thought about her mother's kitchen on Caldwell Lane. She thought about her father's simple meals. She thought about what her mother had said about precision and care, about making something that fits someone so well they forget it took work. Calder Holt rebuilt his relationship with Remy slowly and imperfectly, the way real things are rebuilt, through accumulated small moments rather than a single transformative event. He began to stay home in the evenings more consistently. He began to read to Remy at night instead of leaving it to Millicent. He began to talk about Sable, not constantly, not with the performed grief of someone working through a timeline, but naturally, the way you talk about a person who was real and mattered, and is still, in the truest sense, present. Remy responded to this the way children respond to being given permission. He began to talk about her too. He told Calder once, over breakfast, that the kitchen at Aldgate smelled like Mama. Calder had looked at his son across the table and said, "I know. I think that's why I keep going back." Millicent's husband, Donovan Holt, passed away in the early spring of that year, after 22 months in the coma. Millicent had been with him. She came home that evening, and Remy climbed into her lap without being asked, and she held him and said nothing for a long time. Marlo sent food from the kitchen the next morning, not as a gesture, but as a practical act of care, the kind her father would have recognized. Millicent called to thank her, and the call lasted 40 minutes, and at the end of it, Millicent said, "You cook like someone who knows what food is actually for." "My mother taught me," said Marlo. 3 years after the November evening, Marlo Finch became executive chef of all 11 Holt Meridian locations. She redesigned the culinary program across the group, standardized the credit protocol so that dish creation was documented and attributed properly, and established a scholarship for female culinary students in partnership with Fenwick College, where she herself had trained. The scholarship was named for no one in particular. She chose a name that meant persistence, because that was the most accurate word for the thing she wanted to honor. At the Culinary Industry Awards ceremony in the spring of that year, Marlo received the award for outstanding culinary leadership. The room was full of people who had known her name for 2 years, and some who had known it longer than that, and some who had worked in the same kitchen as her for 6 years without fully seeing her. She stood at the podium and looked at the room for a moment before she spoke. Then she said, "They told me a woman doesn't belong in a professional kitchen. So I didn't argue. I stayed, and I cooked." She paused, and the room was quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something true has been said simply.
My father is a plumber. He fixes things for people who can't afford to pay him because he can, and they need it, and he says that's the whole reason. My mother is a tailor. She says cooking and stitching are the same. Both require precision, both require care. Both are about making something that fits someone so well they forget it took work. She looked down at the award in her hands for a moment. Then she said, "I've been trying to do that. I'll keep trying to do that."
She went home that night to Caldwell Lane, where her parents were awake and waiting, the kitchen light on, her mother's sewing machine quiet for once, and her father's tea already made. She sat at the table where she had eaten every meal of her childhood, and Grover Finch put his hand over hers and said, "Skill grows in silence, Marlowe, I told you." "You told me," she agreed. Outside, the spring evening was warm and ordinary. Somewhere across the city, Calder Holt was reading to his son before bed, and the reading was easy and unhurried, and Remy fell asleep before the chapter ended, and Calder sat for a moment in the quiet of his son's room, feeling something he was slowly, imperfectly, learning to call peace. Some battles are not won by shouting. They are won by staying, by showing up every day in the place where you have been told you do not belong, and doing the work with such consistency and care that the work itself, eventually, becomes the undeniable answer. Marlowe Finch did not win by arguing. She won by cooking. And in the end, the food remembered exactly who had made it. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, subscribe, and comment. Let's spread more stories of kindness and hope together.